What we are going to discuss today is about climate change and security. So while climate change is acknowledged as a security concern, as we can see even in the recent German national security strategy, very clearly climate change is acknowledged and considered a security concern. But at the same time, it is still a very contested topic. It is conceptualized and defined in so many multiple ways. Often it is it's called an international security issue, sometimes a national security issue, sometimes a human security issue, sometimes an ecological security issue. So there are various ways of defining climate change through the security lens. And how are they interconnected? What are the implications of defining them in all these different ways? These are the issues that we are going to discuss today. But if you look at the evolution of the concept of climate security itself, of course, you can trace it back to how environmental security came into the picture when we talk about security studies. But essentially, it's after the UN Security Council introduced it in 2007, with the United Kingdom really introducing it to discuss security implications of climate change. That's when the discussion became more prominent. It became a part of policy circles, even for that matter, military circles. So the UNSC has discussed this issue several times, but also it's not just the UN Security Council. Other intergovernmental organizations, whether it's UN agencies or regional intergovernmental organizations, including the European Union, national governments, humanitarian organizations, non-governmental actors, as well as I mentioned, traditional security actors like the military are now discussing what are the security implications of climate change, or in fact also being influenced by this evolving climate security discourses and practices. But as I said, there are a lot of perspectives on these interlinkages. There's also discussion about what is really missing in this literature. Is there enough representation of the global south perspectives? Are the marginalized voices represented in these discourses? So there are a lot of discussions around that. So the roundtable that we have organized today will explore these different issues from various perspectives, including geographic, theoretical, and policy perspectives in terms of the actors, issues, policies, and so on. It will also look into connecting basically all these different issues that I spoke about with climate security and what this means for institutional and policy responses. We will also discuss what are the gaps in the literature and policy practices, and what are the challenges in terms of translating all these different findings on climate security into practices, or vice versa. And also we will discuss, does research on climate security really contribute to a better understanding about these interconnections and solutions on the ground? So these will be the questions. Before I ask questions to the speakers, I would like to briefly introduce them. We have with us four very eminent speakers who have a lot of experience of working on this issue. I'll start with Marianne Schellekens, who's a research fellow at the Research Unit Littoral Environment and Societies and co-coordinator of the Jean Monnet European Module Rescue at La Rochelle University. Since 2007, she is also European Relations Manager of the French Society for Environmental Law. Her research interests lie in the external relations of the European Union, with a special emphasis on environmental and climate security, the environmental impacts of conflicts, as well as on the role of the EU in polar regions. So yeah, welcome Marianne. Our second speaker, Jürgen Schäffran, he is a professor of geography at the University of Hamburg and the chair of the research group Climate Change and Security in the Center for Earth System Research and Sustainability and the Climate Excellence Cluster CLEEX. After his doctorate in physics, he worked in interdisciplinary research groups in environmental science and peace and conflict research at the University of Marburg, Darmstadt, Paris, and Illinois, as well as the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He has also been involved in projects for the United Nations, Office of Technology Assessment of the German Bundestag, the German Committee for Sustainability Research, and the Expert Commission on the Causes of Forced Migration of the German government. So welcome, Jürgen. Next, we have Sholpon Aitakonova. She's a research fellow at Collective Leadership Institute, Potsdam, under the International Climate Protection Fellowship offered by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. So she's basically part of my cohort, so I'm very happy to have her here. She's also co-coordinator of the Central Asia Youth for Water Network, a member of the Global Women in Water Diplomacy Network, and she's also a CLI certified collective leadership specialist. Cholpon holds an MA degree in politics and security from the OSCE Academy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And she's interested basically in water and climate governance and comprehensive security topics with a focus on dialogue and collaboration in multi-stakeholder settings. Welcome, Cholpon. And last but not the least, I would like to welcome my colleague and in-house expert, Judith Nora Hart. She works as a postdoctoral researcher with the Franco-German Research Center for Social Sciences, Centre Marc Bloch. In 2014, Judith received her PhD in International Relations from the University of the Basque Country in Spain. She worked as a lecturer in International Relations, Nature Conservation and Socioeconomics at the Eberswald University for Sustainable Development, and has been part of the research group Climate Change and Security at the University of Hamburg since 2017. She's also an associated researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy, and since 2021 March, she has been the project manager of the 3-year Franco-German project, Multiple Crisis COVID-19 and the Entanglements of Public Health, Security and Ecology in Europe, which is funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Yeah, so that's the introduction, and yeah, thank you so much, Judith. So we will now move to the questions. So I will actually start with Judith, actually. If I can ask you, because you have also been working on climate change and security for a long time, and I was wondering in your research, how do you see the evolution of this concept, especially in the way we characterize the relationships between climate change and security, especially within the context, for instance, of your project, Multiple Crisis, something that also seems to be sort of acknowledged within the German national security strategy as well, about the interconnections that exist between different issues which require an integrated security response. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Nasri, and I'd also like to thank you all for being here, the co-panelists, and you all, especially at this very warm day. I thought everyone was going to go to the pool, so I'm really happy you're here, and we have a lot to talk about. I'm really excited. Yeah, so very broadly, I mean, you described very well how broad the field is, but actually, I mean, we've been working on this topic also together with Jürgen then, that climate security is a lot of let's say, old wine in new bottles, if you look at the environmental security literature and all of the projects that have been carried out there. So, but I'd like to also say to maybe the ones who are not so familiar to climate and security, maybe in addition, there are two very, very important dynamics which underpin the field. So there's one which is that there's a very strong this thing of fear, right, threat, and we have to with emergency measures get to the solution, and on the other side, this is what climate security is supposed to promise, then we have the effective response and so on. So this is basically the proponents of climate security that hold up this, and this is a strong hope, which is very vibrant, and also for actors to actually take this on and say, wow, now we invented the wheel again, just stick to the climate security guidelines. But then we have the opponents as well, which are saying that it's actually something that is led by geopolitical interests and hidden agenda, that it will lead to the risk of militarization of climate politics and basically be not effective at all, but get it worse. So these are these two camp logic, which is really dominating the field, and also in the UN Security Council. I will talk about this maybe later. That are very important. And so my approach within this field, which, as you said, is about conflict, cooperation, and the end of humanity and justice and everything, like this, is to actually analyze and, well, to use climate security as a research category as such, and to look at how, so how is it, what are the actors and the institutions, the ones who talk about climate security, what do they mean when they say that? So on the basis of what is the threat perceived, what is the fear, what is the basic value that they're concerned about, and what is the responses that they lead to. So so this is something that I carry out within the context of this multiple crisis project as well, because this is well, as in German we have this Zeitenwende, so this idea of looking at what is new, is there something new within these new contexts of COVID pandemic, climate crisis and the war, the Russian aggression war on Ukraine, which is supposed to lead to big change. So this is what we're analyzing. I'm a bit skeptical about the real big change over there. But so within this project, the Multiple Crisis Project that I lead together with Gabriel, we have different formats of working together, and we look at questions as, for example, rethinking governance in times of multiple crisis, and what does existential security mean? Is there something? Do the actors come up with something to that, that responds to somehow to the socio-ecological transformation that is needed within the planetary boundaries framework? And and particularly interesting is also the security, as you said, conceptions and practices. And so, I mean, it's really so clear that we have the European Union had this strategic compass. The France redefined NATO. We had a new NATO concept of security, and Germany just last week it came out. And so we analyze all of these, and I don't want to take too much time now, but it's just to say that we have a final closing conference of our project, which is coming to an end, which is very sad because we should have been 10 people working for 5 years on this topic. As you can imagine, multiple crisis is a huge, huge topic. So at the mid of February, you're all invited. They will present all of the research results.
Thank you. Judith, just to follow up on, I want to specifically sort of come back to the German national security strategy because it was recently released, and one of the things that is clearly highlighted is the fact that, climate change is mentioned almost 70 times in the security strategy, which means this is a very critical issue for the government. In your view, considering you have been looking into the strategy of Germany or policy of Germany or approaches of Germany towards climate security, how has it evolved? How is it different from before? And and the fact that how do you see as you also mentioned, probably this is not going to lead to much change. But then, what kind of change then do you see with this? The fact that it's highlighted so much in the strategy.
Yeah, okay. I think so I didn't have that much time to look into it since last week, but it's still, I think it's really interesting and different from the one before, which was the white, so it was a white paper which was only released from the Ministry of Defense. So now we have an integrative security concept, which seems to be the answer to everything, right? In the multiple crisis, we have also COVID mentioned in there, and migration and all kind of different topics, which I think is really important. They have these 3 pillars. One is robustness, and then resilience, and then it's sustainable development. Or sustainability. So this is quite something, right? That they are bringing that forward, and that it has been presented not also from the Federal Foreign Office, in cooperation with the other ministries. So the idea that security is something that all of the different ministries contribute to, and that they have this guideline to work on that together, and that it's a start, I think that's quite good start. But then, honestly, looking over it, I still need to look into what we can. But what's the difference to human security? Actually, it seems quite close to that too. So, and we also have to wait and look how they're gonna, what's going to come out of that too. So, yeah.
Thank you. Marie, if I can turn to you. You have worked a lot on EU's climate security policies and discourses that have existed within the EU on this issue. And you've also in fact argued that we need an integrated response to environmental security challenges. So could you maybe elaborate a bit upon what this integrated security response looks like, and what it requires, and also what are the climate change considerations for EU security and defense policy over a period of time? How has it evolved? And maybe also talk about EU as a climate security actor. Has it been effective in terms of translating these messages? Yeah.
Yes. It works. Yeah. Okay. It's quite a challenge to explain what the EU is doing with climate security in 5 minutes, because, as you know, the EU is a very complex system. So, what I can do is come back to history just to remind you that, first of all, environmental issues, climate change issues, was not part of the mandate of the EU when it was created. So it started only in '86 when the competence was introduced in the treaties with the Single European Act, and the external dimension came even later. And when I mention this, it's because it came after the Kyoto Protocol. I just want to show you that it was not done by idealism, that the EU thought that maybe we could use our expertise in environmental issues as a leverage to raise our profile on the international arena. So, but this being said, as regards the nexus between climate change and security, the EU was one of the first major international actors to recognize this link already in 2008 in the Solana paper, mentioning climate change as a threat multiplier. And since then, the discourse has become stronger, tend to grow every year. And I cannot have enough time to mention everything, but just a few milestones. 2011, you have climate diplomacy becoming a separate field of action with a specific emphasis on climate security. 5 years later, the action plan on climate diplomacy is adopted, and here it's mentioning that integration of climate security in international negotiation is a key element of conflict prevention. You also have Council conclusions on water diplomacy and so on till the European Green Deal. And the European Green Deal is basically promoting the full transformation of our society to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. If I just digress a moment to point out that this discourse is accompanied by repeated calls to the UN Security Council to take its responsibilities on climate security issues. Why only calls? It's because the EU cannot act at the UN level, only through its active member states, including Germany, by the way, thank you. With this, it's also important to note that for a very long time, the common security and defense policy was not involved in this debate, left totally outside. Why? I think we can see two reasons. The first one is linked to the very nature of this policy, because it was it's an emerging policy, still trying to refine itself. It's also intergovernmental, which never helps. But I think it's also linked to the nature of the political approach of the EU as regards climate security. I think we can define two levels of approach of reaction, political answers. The first one is short-term, which is based on crisis management, short-term reaction, civil protection, crisis management. And the long-term, what is interesting, is mainly based on mitigation, answering the call of scientific community and also implementing the Paris Agreement. What does that mean? That means that when the issues on climate security and adaptation started to be discussed at the EU level, it was mainly for the others. The idea was that climate security will, of course, was a problem, but it will affect others, and it might have some impact within the EU, but an indirect impact. That means maybe an increase of migratory flows or need of additional help, financial assistance, but it was not an EU concern internally. So this is reflected in the EU development policy. If you can find in 2012 and 2013 two communications on resilience in crisis-prone countries or countries affected by food security. And I don't have time to discuss this concept of resilience, but it's a kind of guiding principle of the EU global strategy that was adopted in 2016. If I come back to climate security, I think the European Green Deal was highlight somehow the fact that the EU has understood that climate change was also a concern for the EU itself. And as a consequence, in 2000 later also as well, the Council recognized once again that climate change is an existential threat to humanity, and that one possible answer for the EU should be to add the external dimension to the European Green Deal. We can also discuss if this is the right strategy or not, but as a consequence in practice internally, it has some effect that to involve for the first time the defense community in this debate on climate security. Why? The Green Deal was a catalyst. It's because if you transform the whole society, why should you leave the military aside? If it's the whole society, there is no exception, no derogatory statutes that it used to be. So the same year as when the Green Deal was adopted, the EU Minister of Defense met and admitted that it was important that climate security was an important issue for the defense sector. After this meeting, this will lead to the adoption of several important documents during the last 3 years. The first one is the Roadmap for Climate Defense, adopted in 2020. 1 year later, and this roadmap basically is listing 30 actions to tackle the importance of climate change in planning the operations, in capability development, and international partnership. 1 year later, you have the concept for an integrated approach to climate change and security, which is basically a framework to deal with climate impacts in the EU work on peace and security. And last but not least, the one just mentioned is the strategic compass, and the strategic compass is basically pushing member states to adopt a national plan to green the military and to prepare for climate impacts. So that's basically how the EU has evolved. Those documents have been adopted too recently to be able to assess the implementation and the success. The first thing we can already see by now, it's the discourse is strong and it's getting stronger every year. The implementation is still complicated, and it shows that it's not always easy to make these two communities work together in practice. You can have the environmental advisors, or the text, the structure, but making them work effectively is not as easy as it sounds. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll move to Jürgen now, who has actually worked a lot on, defining these relationships. That some of what was already explained, how EU tries to put all this research in the context of conflict, cooperation, externalization of these threats, and also in terms of what EU itself is facing in terms of the climate emergency or the kind of catastrophic events. And some of your work actually talks about Asia, Africa, and also you also talk about how, one of your recent articles in fact talks about the limits that we are facing in terms of economic limits, ecological limits, in terms of the Anthropocene, and what kind of restrictions this puts on the kind of responses that actors like EU, challenges they face in terms of implementing them. So maybe you could,
Yeah, thank you for raising the question of complexity and the limits. It's not by coincidence that the debate on environmental security and later, climate security emerged after the end of the Cold War. That was a kind of a vacuum at that time, because there was the general impression that the biggest threat of all human times, nuclear war, and the biggest competition between capitalism and communism was finished at that time. So it was expectation of peace dividend and solving the world problems. So there was a shift. Even for myself, I did my PhD in the 1980s on the Cold War and the risks of the Cold War, and finished end of 1989. And then I thought, okay, now I can work on the important things, environmental issues, global problems, poverty eradication, and all the other things. And that was the general attitude that led then to the Rio conference in 1992, and the whole process that was created after that, solving problems, evading risks, avoiding risks, and but very soon this shifted again to the threat terminology. We had several big violent conflicts in the early 90s in the Gulf region, and then later in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and so on. So it shifted more and more and more into this threat terminology. And in this competition of threat thinking, also the environmental debate was increasingly moving into this threat terminology, so talking about environmental conflict, environmental threat. And that was not so much in 1992, because there was a clear separation between the environmental problems and development problems. That was the focus of the Rio conference, and the whole peace issue was left aside at that time. I mean, I was at that time working at the United Nations for a report in '91 to basically convert military resources for the environment, and that was supposed to be part of the Rio process, conversion, disarmament, and threat reduction in the security field. But that report was prepared and was not used for the Rio conference. And there was a clear separation of environment and peace issues and disarmament issues. And this continued and aggravated until today. And now what are we in the current situation? We are kind of back in a new Cold War situation. As we were in the 1980s, the environmental debate started more or less in the 1970s with a report, Limits to Growth. And there was even the US government under Jimmy Carter coming up with this report, Global 2000. There was the preparation of the Sustainable Development Goals and many other activities that were trying to strengthen the environmental field. But that was blocked in the 1980s by the Cold War thinking. And now we are moving back into that situation, that the new Cold War thinking, the major wars that we experience, and particularly in Ukraine, but this is not the only war. We have as many armed conflicts as we never had. Even at the end of the Cold War, we didn't have so many armed conflicts, more than 55. And of course, this attention and focus on violent conflict distracts attention from the climate and environmental field. And this may be one of the reasons why now we see that attention to climate security increasing, saying here, it's not only the other violent conflicts that we have to focus on, because climate change is also a security problem. So, but this, in my view, this distracts the attention away from solutions. If you only see environment and climate as a threat, we think about military solutions to these problems. And this is the biggest risk that I see with this attention towards climate security, that we move towards military solutions to this problem. That doesn't say that I'm against the term climate security, because security has so many different connotations, including human security, ecological security, global security, common security, and cooperative security. I think we should focus more on these meanings of security, not so much on the threat terminology of security, but as a security as an opportunity for solving problems and avoiding, preemptively thinking of avoiding the problem problems, not fighting them after the fact. And that, I think, is the big challenge that we are facing in the current situation, that we move away from this fighting this climate security threats after they exist, after they emerge, but prevent them before. And there's so vast range of opportunities to avoid the climate problem, from the global solutions, global COP process, and going down to the local and national levels. We can discuss this a little later, what possible opportunities exist in this multi-level policy making process to avoid and prevent the climate risks and threats. So much now as an introduction.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up, like one of the issues that is often discussed in the context of linking climate change with security is that is there enough evidence to link climate change with conflicts? I mean, that's also discussed a lot in the UN Security Council, for instance, which says, okay, there are a lot of countries which say, okay, there is not enough evidence to say that climate change causes conflict. Of course, it is, the language has sort of evolved. Now it says it's not causing causal sort of pathways, but it's more like how does climate change act as a threat multiplier? How does it exacerbate existing conflicts? But in your opinion, like, in your research, which is, as I said, you've done a lot of research on this particular nexus itself, how do you think this evidence-based policy making on climate security, is it even possible with the kind of, contestations that exist within the policy arena?
Yeah, climate change in itself is a conflicting issue, but it's not necessarily violent conflict between states. But the attention so far in the research has looked at quantitative indicators measuring in the past the impact of climate variables like temperature and precipitation on violent armed conflict. But conflict is much more. It includes also inner societal conflict, in particular not only as a consequence of the risks of climate change, but also conflicts about preventing climate change, adapting to climate change. And solving the climate problems are also conflicting issues, but these are more inter-societal conflicts, and they are not necessarily violent conflicts. Okay, these are conflicts about changing our lifestyle, our energy system, about our agricultural system, our food. These are conflicts we have with ourselves and with others in society, but we can constructively solve these conflicts. Conflict is not necessarily a negative thing. Conflict can be a way of mobilizing resources to solve these conflict transformation processes. And these conflict transformation processes, they can supplement the social-ecological transformation process. And as long as we leave conflict as a negative thing, we are not able to solve the conflicts of the social-ecological transformation because they are necessarily there, and we need to make constructive use of conflict transformation and sustainable peace and sustaining peace mechanisms within society. And I think this is the big opportunity and challenge of the future, to solve conflicts within our societies associated in the response to climate change.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, just to Marianne, if I can ask you, just linked with that question about conflict itself, what I've also found is that there's not much discussion in climate security about the climate consequences of conflict or war. You have spoken a lot about the ongoing war in Ukraine and the environmental consequences of this war. How do we make sure that these discussions are also integrated into the the climate security literature, which is, as you said, it's not a military solution that we need, or as he said, military solutions may actually be counterproductive. So, in your research, especially with respect to the Ukraine war itself, like how do you see this evolving?
First of all, the environmental impact of the war in Ukraine will be a climate impact in a few years' time. We have already more than 97 million ton equivalent CO2 that was emitted during the first part of the conflict last year. So it's a climate problem, even if you don't see it that way. But it's also a huge environmental problem, just not only with the dramatic catastrophe we see in the media, we talk about the daily practice of the war is impacting the environment. And how do I see this, how do you to include it? I think I'm a lawyer, I'm not a political scientist, so I'm thinking sometimes a bit differently. And for me, what I think, I don't think it's good to work in category. I mean, we need to analyze conflict as such. And conflict, it's bad for several reasons, and for several causes as well. It can create, and so there's a different way. I think we should think about a different way of apprehending the concept of conflict, how it appears, how it develops, and what kind of consequences it has. How you can, where the conflict cycle, where you can stop it, where you can prevent it, but not only focusing on climate, because climate is reductive. Again, we're working on defining categories and defining experts, to be invited in Berlin, which is nice, but I think we don't need experts. We need people to be able to apprehend the global concept of conflict and the global dynamic of conflict. And that's why, for me, what's happening in Ukraine now, it's also climate security. Even if it's not defined as a climate security event.
Yeah, in fact, Ukraine has consistently brought up this issue even in the climate negotiation space, and I think that's the reality that we need to face as well when we discuss the security implications of this war, and especially in the long term. If I can come to Cholpon now, so we are sort of moving away from Europe and we are coming to Central Asia now, where Cholpon's research is mostly concentrated on, and she's worked a lot on climate change and water security in Central Asia. And I just wanted to have your perspectives on the linkages that were already spoken about in terms of how water security is impacted by climate change, and how it also has transboundary impacts in terms of not just conflict but also cooperation between different actors, but also in terms of just understanding the dynamics in the region, because often we speak about the Aral Sea, but it's much beyond that. The problem of water security is much beyond that in the 5 Central Asian republics. So maybe you could reflect a bit upon these issues.
Thank you, Dhanashree. Yeah, I'm very delighted to be here and actually sharing the experiences from Central Asia. And so thank you for the invitation to this roundtable, because yeah, in a way it's also a lot of learning for me now on this broader understanding of the climate security concept, but then also possibly the few points that I will share about this water, climate and security, this interlinkage with the example of Central Asia, would also bring in like newer views on how actually this understanding of climate security and rather this like practices of it happen there. So my key point would actually be that water and this water issues, water cooperation and governance in Central Asia, they could be actually best used like to understand this climate security. Although I have a bit of mixed feelings like towards the concept, like to actually like apply it to the context of the region. What I mean by this is that well, I mean the interlinkages between water security and climate change, they are undeniable. Yes, the science is there, and the impacts of climate change are like mostly and best seen via the effects on the water cycle. And so basically the uncertainties that would be happening to the water cycle, they would, from the climate change, they would be actually affecting all the rest. So the Central Asian region, maybe some of you, I mean, it might be interesting for some of you to learn more a bit of it. So it's, when we say Central Asia, we refer to this area, the space that basically encompasses the former Soviet republics of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. And the region as a whole, it shares borders with Russia, with China, Iran, Afghanistan, and but the countries, they also share two big rivers, Amudarya and Sirdarya, and basically the two rivers, they go across all of the 5 countries, and that way, as the Nasher mentioned, this is known as the Aral Sea Basin, and we are quite notorious with this Aral Sea catastrophe because back many decades ago, like when under the Soviet Union, there was quite a mismanagement of water, and so basically we came up to the point when a large sea, almost like desiccated, you know. But again, so why is water central in this understanding of climate security nexus in Central Asia? Because water is at the core of social and economic development of all of these 5 countries. And so in the literature you would see a lot downstream and upstream countries, and basically, I mean, this is with a reference to these transboundary rivers. And while the downstream countries would use water for agricultural purposes, mainly the irrigation, the needs of the upstream countries would be for this energy purposes, hydropower and so on. So this is the first, let's say, conflict of in terms of the usage of the transboundary waters. Plus, yes, because it's mainly the agricultural economy, so with the population growth and this, the economies are like, for those 2 purposes, they are dependent on the water usage. But then also water is very important when we talk about the relations between the states. And again, when applying this water relations, it's also quite, there are quite tensions, you know. So, but, you know, it gets tricky because it's not necessarily because of water we have the tensions, but oftentimes water gets mixed, let's say, with other issues that cause conflict. For example, the borders between the countries, which we have as the legacy from the Soviet Union. So all of these put together affect the security developments in the region, and climate actually then, as colleagues here mentioned, serves as this threat multiplier. And I actually, when I said I have mixed feelings in terms of understanding the climate security, because I would rather look or better understand security from this OSCE concept of the comprehensive security, where we have all of this together. Yes, this political and traditional, military, human, environmental, economic, all together. So then climate change affects the water relations, but then also the water management within the countries, between the countries of the region, and that way all that also then goes into different consequences for understanding this, the security in the region. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on that, because we've seen in recently also there was a a border dispute over water intake station on the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border, which became like a huge issue. Again, a transboundary issue, which, as you said, it's not entirely because of climate change, but it's like linked with mismanagement of water, something that is traced back to the Soviet era, something that hasn't been addressed till today. So what solutions have therefore thus emerged? Like you spoke about comprehensive security, but like what are the countries in the region talking about in terms of, you know, proposing solutions to this conundrum, which involves so many different issues, tracing also historical baggage, which is something critical to this discourse?
Thank you, Dhanashree. So, yeah, I think it's quite complex to look at this situation, yes, at this concrete example of this disputes, the recent disputes between the two countries of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Why complex? Because indeed, I mean, there is a lot of confusion. Some would say it's because of this natural resource management, water, and the climate effects on the water, and then like the local populations would use water for different like purposes, yes. But here one other element, and here I think I would repeat myself, was the point that there are these border disputes which are unresolved and which are there for, I mean, since our independence back in the early 90s. So it gets again tricky, yes? Yes, on the one hand it is the water disputes, but then we also have this borders layer of the problem and so on. But then again, like coming to the solution side, I think it's also very important to say that, you know, overall in the region, the climate change discussions and this general awareness of the public, but then also of the governments, it's, I mean, increasing. There is this interlinkages again with the climate impacts on the water. But then I am not sure to say that, for example, the countries necessarily, first of all, integrate water into this, whatever, climate national agendas, and then climate and water as central to this security, you know. So, to make it short, the awareness, the discussions are there, but then again, here, like, how to implement, what are the concrete actions, I mean, that's a different question then, you know, because, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that actually brings me to questions about, you know, more of institutional responses, which, as we have seen from the speakers, that it seems the implementation is always a problem. There's a lot of discourse around it, there's a lot of awareness around it, but when it comes to implementation, there seems to be a gap. So I'll come to Judith, actually, who's recently published book on the UN Security Council. Yeah, so there you go. So that's her book. She's received the copies just yesterday, in fact. So yeah, good timing. So the book essentially talks about these different approaches, climate security approaches of different countries. I mean, as Cholpon also mentioned, there are contestations over, you know, what climate security means in different contexts. I was just wondering, from, you know, from the book and from your understanding of so many different authors coming together and talking about this issue from different contexts, what could be the UN Security Council's role in shaping the agenda on climate security, which is, you know, I mean, coming from India, a country which has opposed discussing climate change in the Security Council since the beginning. So I know it's like it's also like a question of when would this be acceptable and when would the consensus be reached. But yeah, so if you can just shed light on, you know, some of these concerns about you know, not just UN Security Council's role, but beyond that in terms of implementation or in terms of finding solutions through this framing, or does it actually produce more problems than giving solutions?
Thank you. Lots of questions. Well, first of all, coming back to the book. No. I'm really happy it arrived yesterday, and you will find some copies over there if you want to have a look, and some book flyers. So we're really glad about this. Maybe get back a little bit and talk about how this book came into being and what it's about, and then I'll try to to answer those questions. So actually, sorry, it's the result of a research project which I carried out in the year 2020, and actually Jürgen was the one to introduce to make the link between the Federal Foreign Office that had a seat on the UN Security Council, so they were very interested in the topic. And actually it was really fun to establish that project together with them, so in co-creation in the sense of showing them where the science is on the topic and looking into what are the problems and questions and interests they have. As I already said, so there's often a hidden geopolitical interest behind, but actually it was really great to do, to establish, and together also with the research group of Jürgen, Climate and Security Research Group, and the Institute of Peace Research and Security Policy Hamburg, and to see how open actually the Federal Foreign Office was to do some new kind of approaches and researches. And actually we also had that recently with the Berlin University Alliance and the Federal Foreign Office. They met together to establish more, contact between science and practitioners, and I think that's really something that needs to be done. So this is really great. So what we did in that book is, or in that research project, which was 11 months, so very short time, and it hit totally the Corona pandemic time, which is really hard thing to do, is we established a network of partner scientists, so 15 from 15 countries, from the ones that were seated at the UN Security Council in the year 2020, and we established reviews as well from the countries, and we asked them, so within a very broad guidelines and methodology, how is like the basic question was, is climate change recognized as a threat to security within the country? And the researchers went out into the field, looked into the primary documents from all different ministries. So the question was, and this is how we sidepast this question of, is there an evidence about is there a link between climate change and conflict or peace? But we just asked, do they recognize that? Acknowledge the link? And if, how? And I mean, as you can imagine, we had the St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a very small island. We had Niger and Vietnam, Indonesia, and of course the 5 veto powers, and many others. And they had very different views on how climate and security is linked. And it was, surprising actually to see how much it was recognized. So within all these documents. So that was also an interesting approach that we did, because we looked back into what are the states doing, and thereby sidepast this question of, it should be acknowledged at the UN Security Council, yes or no, because there's this big discussion. So of course there was political interest and power plays there within the UN Security Council, and was just to look back, what are they doing, and then to bring forward dialogue in the sense of providing a systematic analysis of what they're doing, and then bring them together and talk, and maybe also have, gather lesson learned. Like there's already been, how do you say, like, it's already recognized in a way. that was really surprising. So so this book was then, we actually, from this research project, we established that into a book, with the help of the co-editors, Cameron Harrington, Francisco von Lucke, Adrien Sterck, Nicolas Simpson, and with the help of, and the financial support of the Centre Marc Bloch and the Durham University, which is really great. So we were able to develop this research further, and it just came on. So, so apart from the fact that it was really acknowledged broadly, that was surprising, is that we also saw, like, also in very different security strategies, it was also, and especially also I was surprised the African security strategy, they have also recognized that there is this existential threat to humanity, which is often, has not been often mentioned in the others. But I mean, there's a couple of different research results I had. Maybe that's too long now to go into that. I can go into the, yeah? Okay, okay. So what we actually saw there was that, as opposed to the theory is that often we have, as you said, state security, or national security, human security, ecological security. The states, they mix all of the things. So theory is not applying there in the sense. And even well, if you see that there's a threat described, maybe the response does not really, fit the threat. So that is actually the whole thing. Existential security is recognized by many of them, but the response is, well, looking at climate politics, and so actually not recurring to military. That was also something that, as this fear of militarization of the field. We have to differ. I know, Jürgen, we have to differentiate it a bit. But actually, this calling to the military to effectively do something on climate change was not found in there. But I would, on what you just said on the European Union and the roadmap, I think that this is. And maybe this could be a question for you, but I don't want to get into this too much. But I see that this existential security threat is maybe mentioned, but it's more about conflict, and as you already said, outwards somewhere there, and that the military has to change. But that's huge. I'm not saying that this is not important, but that is somewhat frustrating because that's all about it from my perspective. I did some analysis where I compared the European Union, like what they did on the roadmap and the strategic compass and climate diplomacy in comparison to what science, the Earth system scientists, IPCC reports and so on would suggest to do, And if you compare that, this is it's just not getting together. So it's only about conflict again, and that is also, frustrating in the sense, as you ask, what role could the UN Security Council play? We also have to acknowledge that the UN Security Council has unofficially recognized climate change and security in the sense of there's some resolutions on certain geographical areas, mainly Africa, Cyprus as well, and I don't remember, there's one other one, which is outside from African country, but actually there is some recognition, but the official recognition and this resolution, this is a real fight, and as you just said, they also, they try to put up a resolution. Nigeria did that last year in December 21, and it got vetoed, so it didn't come into that. So at least within the research, we said at least the UN Security Council should recognize officially that this cross-cutting issue of climate change, and it has to evolve in the sense that it's still very much based on after-war realities, like in Second World War realities, and this has to adapt. Still, we somehow, and this is also in the book, if it would just recognize it officially, what would happen then? Well, it's still only focused on conflict, and so there's no institution, and that's so horrifying. No institution that is actually taking care of this existential threat, which, as I said in the beginning, is underpinning the whole thing. But we have the UNFCCC, but nothing is in there in between. So they both, all the institutions, they both say, no, you have to take care of that, and so it's not happening. So a recommendation that came out of when we established the policy brief for that was actually to also include Science Hub. So science more, because that was something really concerning also to see within all of those primary documents, science and IPCC maybe once turns out, but there's no reference to science or to climate science or to others. In the German, there was one back in 1988 or something like that, but that was really surprising. And we're not talking about all the sciences that is actually been working on climate and security and environmental security literature. That is not at all referenced as well. So this is something that really needs to be improved. And also the European Union is not, like within all of those documents, they're not, that is something concerning. So as I said, I think it's, they should at least recognize it, but there should be it would not help in the sense of bringing us the solution. But actually, I'd like to know more about your Indian case. I mean, she is moderating, right? But she's a real expert on these questions as well, and I think it's really interesting also to get your perspective on this.
Okay, I wasn't expecting that. Okay. I mean, you know, from Indian perspective, it's not as much about climate security. I think it's about UN Security Council as a platform to discuss this, which is I think also an important issue for the Indian, you know, government, or it's been a long-standing sort of position. It hasn't changed. I don't know if it's going to change in the near future, but I think the main issues, of course, there's a lot of talk about, oh, this would militarize the climate change discourse. The other concern is that okay, there is not enough evidence, or this is all about conflict kind of discourse. We don't need to talk about this in the UN Security Council. We have UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have other more representative bodies where we need to discuss climate change, and not UN Security Council with just 15 members, and also among them 5 with veto powers. So that is, I think, the main concern for India, that this would be used as a kind of a tool to also, to say, invoke responsibility to protect and use military solutions where you don't need military solutions, but actually need more development assistance, or other kind of solutions, or the fact that it would be used to impose sanctions on countries that do not comply with certain trade regulations, climate regulations. So all these concerns, especially for a country like India, which has been under sanctions for long, for some other policies, not necessarily climate policy. So these are obviously like concerns as UN Security Council takes upon itself the role of a guarantor of climate security. Rather, it should be other organizations and other platforms that should discuss it. So I mean, that's Indian position on this. But I mean, essentially, even if you talk about India's policies on climate security, there's more acknowledgement of it at the domestic level. Maybe at the regional level, considering you have again South Asia being having a lot of transboundary rivers, and climate change having those impacts on the rivers is something that obviously is of concern. So at the regional, domestic level, there is much more acknowledgement than at the international level, and that is, I think, because UNSC is becoming the face of it, and that's like very concerning for the government. So yeah, I would say that. Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to the speakers, and I mean, just following up, Jürgen, I mean, something that you mentioned in your introductory remarks as well, and I've seen that in your articles as well. You mentioned Zeitenwende, and how instead of Zeitenwende for arms race and war, more promising a sustainable climate protection and a peaceful energy transition within planetary boundaries. I'm just quoting this from one of your recent articles. But also you mentioned about externalization of climate security, essentially like the EU and others, talking about this as a problem of somewhere else, but essentially it's also a problem that EU is facing, and also countries in the global north. Like we saw recently the Canadian forest fires, like engulfing many cities. What is the course correction that countries like Germany and others in the particularly in the global north need in terms of redefining this Zeitenwende, and also redefining what climate security would mean in terms of the changes that you need at home?
Yeah, the first phases of this debate on environmental conflict and climate security was more on external threats in climate hotspots elsewhere. And that was clearly dominated from the northern perspective. Most of the research groups were in Europe or the United States. And the focus of these research groups was mostly devoted on the risks to the global south. So they were assuming that the climate risk multiplier assumes that it multiplies the conflicts in the global south, and on water, food, migration, and other issues. So it was clearly dominated from the north to the south threat perspective, with some assumptions that the north might intervene, not necessarily with military force, but of course if there is a violent conflict, then automatically the question of violent intervention comes up in any parts of Africa, for instance, or in the Middle Eastern countries, mostly with allied countries. But that was not the dominant focus, was the intervention discourse. It was mostly that it increases the problems in the south. And it might also affect the north through migration, for instance, or through violent conflicts that are spreading, and also the resource issue. For instance, that some resources might be affected in a conflict-prone region of Africa. That was so much the discourse in the 1990s and the 2000s. I think the more recent discourse also discusses and considers the risks to the North itself, because you cannot say that the North will be free of climate risk or climate threat. Climate change is not a security risk to the North, independent of the South. You can see clearly that more and more climate risks affect the northern countries. The flooding in Western Germany in 2 years ago, for instance, and the risk to coastal regions or to urban areas or to water in Germany or in Central Europe, or the water risk of dry times on nuclear power in France, and so on and so on. More and more this discourse is emerging that climate change is a security risk also for the global North. And I think the North is not very well prepared yet, I would say, to deal with these security risks, because they do not really fit this common threat terminology where you can fight the threat. I mean, you can prevent maybe the risks, but you cannot fight the threat after the fact, because fighting all these floods and weather extremes and so on is a very expensive task, and the military is not well prepared for it anyway. Coming back to this discussion that you raised, that what is the role of the military? Okay, I mean, in my introduction I suggested that the military is not very well fit to deal with the climate problem. Does not mean that the military has no capability to deal with these problems. There are some initiatives like the planetary security initiatives where some military people are taking part, and I think normally they would say they have good intentions of reducing these climate risks, and they think about how the military can, for instance, make their own armament or their own military force more environmentally compatible and reduce the biggest damages from military fighting. This is the new discourse that war fighting and warfare is very damaging to the environment, is releasing a lot of carbon emissions. So that is also becoming more, the military is becoming more sensitive to these questions. We see that in the Ukraine war is now everything is in place for the environmental harm from warfare, because it's very damaging. We only to mention the dam burst and all the side effects, but we could also mention the explosions in the Baltic Sea of the gas pipeline is also environmental warfare in a certain sense. And all these things become also now more in the middle of the attention is the negative side effects of the conflicts. And the question is how we come out of this negative vicious circle, because if we assume that climate change leads to more violent conflict, and violent conflict is very damaging to the environment, this is a kind of vicious circle, self-enforcing problems. So we need to reverse it with a positive, virtuous circle. Yeah? We can think about how conflict resolution, conflict avoidance is good for the environment, and how environmental protection and sustainability is good for peace building processes. So we need to reverse this negative circle to a positive circle. And here is much more efforts and thinking needed in the future research to how we make that conversion from the negative circle to the positive circle. And this comes in concepts like sustainable peace. Sustainable peace means the mutual strengthening of peace building and sustainability and sustainable development. If you take it as a triangle, peace, sustainability, development can mutually enforce each other. And other concepts is environmental peace building, making environmental projects an issue that can contribute to peace, even between organizations that are in conflict. For instance, there is this water project between NGOs, Palestinian NGOs, Israeli NGOs, Jordanian NGOs on water protection. Even though the governments are in conflict with each other, the people, the local people, can work together and trying to reverse it, use the solving of environmental problems as a contribution. It can be done at very local scale, but it can be also done at global scale, of course. So this is really an opportunity for the future. Another issue is the migration is often seen in negative terms. Migration as such is not negative. Only if it's forced migration, if it's forced displacement or refugees, they have no choice to move. But if they adapt to climate change by moving from place A to B, this is not necessarily a negative thing, because this taking part as an adaptation can mean get a job elsewhere. And when I have a job elsewhere, where that ever is, in urban areas or in the global north, they have an income, and then I can send some money back to their home countries, and these remittances can be also a contribution to solve some of the problems. And in many parts of the world, these remittances are larger than the international development aid or the foreign investments. Just to say, if problems increase, also solutions increase, but they need some institutional support. This is the challenge. It can be done individually, but it's better to do it together with government help.
Okay.
Just very briefly, because I just want to insist that in this context, the EU is the only one having a positive message, saying that you can adapt to. That's what, even if it has some limits, the exportation of the Green Deal is showing that we can develop outside the EU a society that is functioning and respecting the climate and the environment. I know there are a lot of limits in the implementation, but at least it tends to promote a positive message and not only talking about threat and despair. So I agree with you, we lack positive message in our world.
Yeah, I mean, if I can come back to you, and another research focus of yours is on Arctic, which is always talked about a lot in climate security literature, about, opening of new sea routes and how climate change is going to, lead to more exploration and exploitation of resources and all of that. Again, it's seen through the lens of how we can use this opportunity, but at the same time, there's also a lot of discussion on how this can increase militarization of the Arctic, or how it can actually lead to more problems among the littoral countries, but also with the emergence of new powers like China and various other countries, which also are interested in making those entry. So I mean, what can the EU do in this kind of context, especially with the EU not really having such a big role in the Arctic as compared to if you look at the littoral countries, obviously yes, but also in generally about Arctic security and climate, what is the positive message out there?
Let's try to find positive message. What I might disappoint you, but I think the biggest challenge in the Arctic is not what's going to happen in the Arctic, it's the impact of what's happening in the Arctic to the rest of the world, actually. The Arctic is warming 3-4 times faster than the rest of the world, and obviously, okay, it can open shipping routes, it can give access to new resources, oil, fossil fuels, or critical materials. But I think the main problem is that you have the melting of Greenland, the permafrost, and the weakening of the jet stream and other ocean streams that will have deep impact on the climate, sea level-wise, that will be a real climate security risk for the rest of the world, not for the Arctic. In the Arctic, the EU has an Arctic policy. It's not the most powerful policy. It is trying at least to protect the environment in the European Arctic, because obviously the EU cannot regulate the Canadian Arctic or the Russian Arctic. And as regards the Russian Arctic, it's very limited for the moment. The cooperation is very limited. So the EU is not a big Arctic actor, but at least try to promote, to preserve the current state of the environment in the Arctic, try to accompany the climate change process, to support the communities there. And it won't have a huge impact, because when you have Russia, which is half the Arctic territory, it's not what the EU is doing at this level. Everything is based on international cooperation, but at least I believe strongly in the role model, that if things are working, if you could show people that things are working, maybe they will tend to try to reproduce it.
I'll come to Cholpon next about, something that you've been also mentioned, solutions can work at the local level, on the local scale, and there are a lot of, very good examples of that. Someone who's been working with women's networks and youth networks in Central Asia and beyond that, in fact, you also work with global networks. I was wondering, what is the role that women and youth networks can play in water security and cooperation, particularly in building, peace building, maybe what he was mentioning also in such initiatives in Central Asia?
Thank you very much. I think women and youth, they play an irreplaceable role, let's say, in building this dialogue and cooperation between the countries. And again, because I base it on my experience on Central Asia, yes. So, for example, while there are these tensions on the state level between the countries of the region, for example, the civil society, including the youth, the women networks, they would be more flexible. The academic sector, in terms of building this dialogue, exchange, establishing the networks itself. So it is indeed on this rather positive and on the solutions side, because it can also be referred as the contribution to the so-called, let's say, water and climate diplomacy. But overall, a very interesting point, I think, is that, this trends of inclusion, of inviting more women, more youth to participate in not just the discussions, but then this decision-making on water and climate topics. It's they are rather global trends, And basically, this well aligns with the overall SDG and agenda, yes. And we have this particular goals, the 5th and the 13th and the 6th and etc. The 16th of more inclusion. But then we also have the resolutions on women, peace and security of the UN Security Council, on the youth, peace and security. So basically all of this, they are, let's say, empowering or inviting for more participation and actually empowerment of these groups, in this promotion of water cooperation, climate cooperation. But then it gets very interesting when we, let's say, apply, when we look at the application, let's say, of this global trends of inclusion of women and youth on the example of Central Asia. Because then it's very unusual, because traditionally we had quite barriers, let's say, with youth and women voices and their inclusion, and we are talking about, this hybrid regimes, rather authoritarian, we are talking about this rather patriarchal societies. And so with having these trends of inclusion in the countries of the region, we are at the same time, dealing with, let's say, looking closer at the reality of this social inequality, in terms of gender, age, the social status. So I don't know whether it's good or bad, but it's rather, this trends of inclusion and participation and empowerment on the example of Central Asia, where we have issues with that. It's very interesting, because we are inviting women and youth to participate in this decision-making and provision of their solutions in the context where it's hard to do it, So it's really interesting to look at it, maybe this application of these trends as rather a pathway, you know, for yeah, like building better cooperation and yeah. Yeah.
And just to kind of follow up on that, because you have spent a lot of time now in Europe. You've also been working with research institutions in Germany, in Sweden, and others. I mean, what role can this kind of research really play in terms of also promoting diplomacy, diplomatic solutions, and trying to see if the kind of research that you have done here and with your networks back in Central Asia, and also linking those networks with the global arena, because like you said, it's the context that you're talking about. It's not very easy to have an inclusive agenda in societies that are probably not very democratic, or not very inclusive, or hasn't been very inclusive for a long time. So I was thinking maybe you could reflect a little bit on your own personal experience of trying to build these bridges between networks, transboundary networks, which is so critical to this as well. So
yeah, I think it's I mean, definitely the empowerment of youth and women, and not just for the sake of like wider representation, but like thinking a bit long term, and like in terms of this ensuring continuity, in policy, and like overall towards like water and climate cooperation. I think it's a very good thing to do, because yeah, I mean, with this empowerment comes also like not just this learning, whatever happening there at the global level, but then also like applying it domestically, but then also building this exchange and dialogue, because I also looked at the recent studies, let's say, of whatever the situation in terms of this climate, not just climate security research, but then the climate change research overall. And then I learned that, yeah, there are these biophysical features of the climate impacts are there, but then how really this I mean, this whole affects the socio-economic, yeah, the status. I mean, it's still lacking. It's there. I mean, but yeah. So putting all of this together, I think, yeah, it is absolutely relevant to continue supporting it. But then also at the same time, like this internal dialogue, internal like reflection should be happening. Yeah, like more of awareness of your context, not just like accepting whatever is coming from the outside, because then we see the difficulties of its application, yeah.
Thank you for that. So I'll just move on to the last round of questions here, and maybe I'll just start with you, because you have the mic, so it's easier to pass it along. I mean, in terms of the challenges that you mentioned some of them already, but I was just wondering, like in terms of research and practice of climate security generally, like what are the challenges that you see, and translating all that research into sort of policy at the local level. And I'm going to ask the other speakers also, specifically about these challenges that we face in terms of, like what research is being done, and what is the future of climate security research. So that will be like the common question. But I'll start with Cholpon more like from a practical point of view. Yeah.
I think it's useful, to expand this overall climate security nexus research, because I mean, there are quite interlinkages, I mean, you can link it basically to all sorts of security, yes, and then how all that affects the countries, the communities. So definitely, again, as I said just a few seconds ago, that in Central Asia, particularly, the studies of this socio-economic impacts of climate change are rather limited. So this would definitely help, because then we are talking about how to formulate the policies, right, based on the evidence. And so I think that there should be investments into the research, rather the social side, and there should be a strengthened exchange between the relevant communities in the region. There should be this gap bridged between the science and policy, because as I said in the very beginning, there are these there is this increased awareness, but then also these policy discussions happening, in countries of the region. But then again, it should be really this exchange, interaction should be happening between the sectors, between the levels.
Marianne, if you can, maybe reflect a bit from a French perspective in France, like where does the research stand and what is the future?
It's very easy, the research stands almost nowhere in France. I will just give you an anecdote. When I was drafting my PhD, it was a late PhD I did after several years career, and I chose this topic on environmental security in the external relation of the EU. And when I was finished, people said, "Oh, it's very good PhD, but you're lacking French doctrine. It's very important to put French doctrine if you want to have a PhD." And I really cried. I couldn't find anything French doctrine. So the research is nowhere in France. I mean, now it's a bit more. We have few people working on it, like Adrien, but they're mainly political scientists, not the only political scientists. I think as a lawyer, I'm totally isolated because it doesn't pay to make a career on climate security or environmental security in France. So that's the current state of the research field in France. And what I would, not in French, but in general context, what I would recommend to improve the prevention of climate security, is I think it's more interdisciplinary research. Because we talk a lot, but we don't know much, let's be honest. there are a lot, we don't know anything about tipping point of ecosystems. We don't know when the climate impact will become a real security issue. What can we do? But I mean, it's not only political scientists which are discussing, it's not only social scientists. I mean, we need hard science to understand what's at stake. We need also lawyers, sorry. you need a lot of different communities, and these communities to talk to each other. And I know it's difficult because they don't speak the same language. Very often I'm sometimes even fed up to have all this political theory when I read things about climate security. It's not the same language, but we could have a common understanding, and that would help us move forward. And I have other options, other ideas, but maybe I leave some ideas to the others.
You by yourself, you have produced so much literature on climate security, and from all the interdisciplinary perspective, I was looking at your publications and I've read your works, while also doing my research on this, and I was wondering, looking back at all that work that you have done so far, and what do you see needs to? I mean, I'm sure, there are a lot of things that you are, already thinking of in terms of what you can work on. But what is the future of climate security research? And and how, what are the gaps that you think should be really addressed at this stage?
Yeah, in your question, the first question to me, you mentioned the limits to the Anthropocene, which was also my last publication, actually, last month. And I tried to recapitulate the question of the limits, which are not only planetary boundaries, which are multiple limits. We had now several hundred years of expansionism, which started from Europe, more or less, which moved to other parts of the world, colonialism, imperialism, and trying to conquer these parts of the world, make it property to us, yeah? And make other parts of the world supporting us. We are owning the resources of others, we made others to slaves, and we, in a certain sense, expanded our own worldview to the rest of the world, from the European part of the world. But now we see limits. Of course, most prominent are the planetary boundaries. Since several years this is discussed, which are the ecological and environmental limits, but these are not the only limits. We have also political limits, we have economic limits, we have social limits, and we have even scientific technological limits, which are described in this article. If we don't deal with these limits, then we move into more and more crisis, because when you reach a boundary, the current expansionist approach can no longer continue. And this runs into a crisis of this approach, because others resist. Nature resists to this expansionism, but developing countries, the global south, also resists. Or there's also resistance at the Russian border, if you wish, and at the other border where this existing model is expanding. So we have to think about the limits of this expansionist approach and convert it. I do not necessarily say we give up in general on an expansion, but it has to be a different way of expansion. It must be a respective, we have to respect the areas and the regions into which we are expanding. We should do it not against them, but together with them. This also applies to nature. We should not act against nature, but together with nature, but we should also act with others in sharing resources, because we're all connected. Of course, we are connected to the atmosphere, we're connected to water cycles, we are connected in many different ways. We are sharing all these resources globally now, and there is no much space anymore for this existing expansionist approach. So we must find a new one. And to put it shortly, a resource like water divides enemies, but it connects friends. And this, I think, is a different approach, that we should have a connective approach where we move into a world where we are not hostile to each other, but think about the beneficial modes. And for that reason, I think the approach of sustainability and peace fit very well together. So.
Yes.
Last word goes to you, Judith.
Okay, yeah. I mean, what I would say is that we have been looking in the, as you said, also the military is taking up the topic. I mean, NATO is building this center in Montreal on climate and security. The European Union has adopted it and so on. And we have so many actors that actually talk about climate and security. So there seems to be a more consensus that this is something important to do. But still, I think that what would be important is to really look into what are they doing, so to be critical and to maintain that critical, because somehow in the literature we've seen in the last times that this critical approach should be a bit strengthened. So I would think that also in order to prevent history repeating, as we said, we had environmental security, then climate security, we had many topics that repeat themselves. It would be good to initiate a new integrative research wave. As you said, very important with bringing different disciplines together, because that's the whole topic. It lies at the edge of many disciplines, and no one is, there's not one which has to say on that, but it's actually only working if you bring them together. And also they are all talking about the topics. The Earth system scientists, and also they are talking about conflict and peace. So the peace and conflict studies, people are saying, what are you talking about? This is our subject. So they should talk much more to each other, which is not so easy. And the research should be much more accessible in a way, so it's lacking actually institutional support. I mean, as you said, in France there's almost nobody working on the topic. In Germany, Jürgen is a central point, and as I heard, you will retire soon, so I'm very worried about what's happening afterwards. In the sense of the topic is somehow dying, and I mean, we have we have the big think tanks who are really working on the topic, and they are informing the decision makers, which is also quite problematic if you think about the fact that they get money to to do something that they think that the donors will approve on. So how to change the things that need to be changed. So I think actually that should be something that should be looked at more into the science policy nexus and power plays, which are also going to expertise. That should be an important thing to look at. And I mean, there's several couple minor things as well, and Dhanasri, we're working on a paper on that, so that will also come out. And but most importantly, I think that I'm absolutely with you in terms of focusing more on peace and cooperation and bringing results. But what I actually miss in the whole field is we have this conflict bias, which is the strongest, then this peace and cooperation, which is like the response to the counteract. But the third pillar on, as I said this before, existential questions is still missing somehow. It's all over the place, as I said, but it's not really worked on in such a systematic way, and I think that should be carried further, yeah. But then, as I said, the most important thing is we need some scientific hubs, so to say, to work on these things together, which is really missing. And yeah, I mean, there are some from the Environmental Peace Building Association, and so Irvine. There's been a new creation of Association Climate and Security from Canada, because they're very close to the NATO center that is being established there, and we're also part of that. But yeah, in Europe, it's just like very scarce, and I hope that after this discussion you've seen that should be an important thing to look at. Thank you.
Yep, thank you so much for all these responses. I mean, as you could see, there were like a wide range of responses that came from all the four speakers, depending on the context, depending on the research that is happening, or depending on the worldviews. I mean, I think it's so important to recognize the fact that we look at these issues maybe from a socio-economic point of view, maybe from this threat perception, maybe from an existential issue, or the fact that we need an integrated response, or the fact that there's not enough being done on this, and what can be done. So there are a lot of things that we still need to discuss, and I hope this also generates some interest in how we go forward with climate security research. So thank you so much for all the responses.